Have you ever wondered what would happen if a moment of fate collided with a heart of courage? A moment so shocking that it changes everything in a single breath. In a grand ballroom, a chandelier begins to fall, and a child without hesitation risks everything to save a stranger. But this isn't just any child. It's a young boy from the streets, and what happens next is nothing short of miraculous. The grand ballroom shimmered with an opulence that only the wealthiest could afford. Gilded columns lined the walls, massive floral arrangements overflowed from crystal vases, and the glow of 1,000 twinkling lights reflected off polished marble floors. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the quiet hum of an orchestra filled the air as guests, draped in designer gowns and tailored suits, moved effortlessly between conversations, their presence radiating privilege and power. At the heart of it all stood the billionaire's wife, a woman whose name alone commanded admiration. Draped in an elegant champagne-colored gown that hugged her figure like a second skin, she held her audience captive with nothing more than a practiced smile and the occasional flick of her jeweled hand. Every detail of her appearance, from the way her diamonds glistened under the chandelier's warm light to the graceful way she sipped from her crystal glass, was deliberate. She had been in this world of excess for so long that she knew nothing else. Among the sea of luxury, a boy weaved through the crowd, a stark contrast to the guests around him. He was no more than 10, a child of the streets, though tonight he was a server, one of many hired for the night's event. His crisp white shirt and black slacks were borrowed, ironed so many times that the fabric was beginning to thin. Unlike the guests, he was invisible, just another set of hands moving plates and pouring drinks. The weight of the room pressed against him, not just in the heavy trays he carried, but in the way eyes skimmed over him, as if he did not exist. He was used to it. He had spent his life being unseen, learning that those with money seldom spared a thought for those without. Still, he worked hard, determined not to give them any reason to complain. He balanced his tray carefully, moving between guests with practiced precision, ensuring he did his job flawlessly. But no amount of effort could change the way they looked at him. As he passed by the billionaire's wife, she barely acknowledged him. Not even a glance. He might as well have been a piece of furniture. The only time she seemed to notice his presence was when she wrinkled her nose in distaste, as if the mere proximity of someone like him threatened the perfection of the evening. He had learned long ago that people like her saw him as nothing more than an inconvenience. Still, he said nothing. He kept his head down and continued his work, ignoring the growing unease settling in his chest. Above them, the grand chandelier, the crown jewel of the ballroom, hung suspended from the ceiling. It was a masterpiece, adorned with hundreds of hand-cut crystals, its golden frame gleaming in the soft light. It had watched over decades of celebrations, a silent witness to the affairs of the elite. But tonight, something was different. The boy, moving swiftly through the crowd, felt it before anyone else. A shift in the air, a subtle groan from above like the sound of strained metal barely holding together. He froze for just a second, his eyes flickering toward the massive fixture above. Something wasn't right. The billionaire's wife, lost in conversation, stepped directly beneath the chandelier. She tossed her head back in laughter, her voice light and carefree, completely unaware of the disaster looming overhead. Then it happened. A sharp, metallic snap cracked through the ballroom, silencing the chatter in an instant. Gasps rippled through the crowd as heads turned upward, eyes widening in horror as the massive chandelier trembled its bolts giving way. It was falling. Time stretched thin, a breathless moment suspended between life and death. The boy's tray crashed to the ground, forgotten as his legs moved before his mind could catch up. The weight of instinct, of something bigger than fear, drove him forward. He lunged toward the woman, toward the person who had barely spared him a glance all evening, and shoved her with all his strength. She stumbled backward, a gasp escaping her lips as she fell away from danger. The chandelier came crashing down, shattering against the marble floor in a spectacular explosion of glass and gold. The force sent shards flying, some cutting into the boy's arms and face, but he barely registered the pain. Silence swallowed the room. Dust and crystal fragments settled as the reality of what had just happened took hold. The billionaire's wife, shaken and breathless, turned her wide eyes toward the boy. For the first time she truly saw him, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. The boy had never known a world like this. The dazzling chandeliers, the marble floors polished to a mirror shine, the endless laughter of people who had never once worried about where their next meal would come from. It was a stark contrast to the life he lived outside these walls. He had grown up in a neighborhood where struggle was woven into everyday life. His mother worked 2 jobs, coming home exhausted, but still managing to check his homework, still making sure he ate even when she went to bed hungry. His father was gone, lost to a world that had too many vices and too few ways out. The boy knew what it meant to go without, to watch bills pile up, to see his mother's hands tremble as she counted change at the grocery store. Yet, despite the hardships, he had never let bitterness take root in his heart. He had been raised to believe that kindness did not require wealth, that character was the greatest currency a person could have. His mother had always told him, "We might not have much, but we have integrity, we have courage. That's worth more than all the money in the world." And so, when the opportunity arose to work as a server at the grand event, he took it without hesitation. The money would help, even if only a little. He had expected the cold glances, the way people's eyes slid right past him as if he were invisible. He had been ignored before, and tonight was no different. The wealthy guests saw only their reflections in the sparkling glasses they held, never the people who handed them their drinks. Among them was the billionaire's wife. She was the type of woman who had never wanted for anything. Born into wealth, she had seamlessly transitioned from the daughter of a businessman to the wife of one of the most powerful men in the city. Her life was a carefully curated picture of perfection. Designer gowns, exclusive events, people who hung on to her every word not because of what she said, but because of who she was. She had learned early that power was not just about money, but about perception. She moved through the world untouched, admired, envied, and feared in equal measure. People did not question her. They wanted to be her. But beneath the flawless exterior was a heart that had never been tested, a soul that had never been asked to look beyond the world of wealth and privilege. She had spent her life believing that status dictated worth, that the world was divided between those who mattered and those who did not. And to her, the boy did not matter. He was just another servant, another nameless face in a sea of staff who existed to ensure the evening went smoothly. She barely acknowledged him when he moved past her, her gaze passing over him as if he were a shadow rather than a person. It was not cruelty, it was indifference. She had never been forced to see people like him, and she never had a reason to. But all of that changed the moment the chandelier fell. 1 second, she had been standing beneath the golden light, basking in the attention of her peers. The next, she had been pushed back, her body jolted out of harm's way, as crystal and metal crashed to the floor in a deafening explosion. And there, standing before her, was the boy she had ignored all evening. She looked at him now, really looked at him, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, his arms scraped from flying shards of glass, his hands trembling from the effort of what he had just done. He had saved her, without hesitation, without thought for himself. For the first time in her life, she was speechless, and for the first time in his, he was seen. The grand chandelier swayed ever so slightly, its golden frame trembling, as if whispering a warning no one was paying attention to. The ballroom remained alive with laughter, glasses clinking, and the hum of conversation. The wealthy guests, wrapped in their own indulgence, did not notice the shift above them, but the boy did. Balancing a tray of empty glasses, he moved carefully through the crowd, his eyes always scanning, always aware. It was a skill he had honed growing up, paying attention to the details, the things others ignored. And right now, something was wrong. A deep, creaking groan rippled through the ceiling. His eyes flicked upward. The chandelier was moving. It wasn't the gentle sway of something caught in a draft. It was unnatural, heavy, dangerous. His grip on the tray tightened as realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The bolts holding the chandelier in place were giving way. It was falling. His heart slammed against his ribs. Panic flared in his chest, but he had no time for fear. His gaze dropped immediately to the ground, to her. The billionaire's wife stood directly beneath the chandelier, still locked in conversation, blissfully unaware of the danger above her. Her delicate fingers traced the rim of her glass as she laughed lightly, the sound elegant, practiced. The world around her did not exist in that moment. Only her audience, and the luxury she was wrapped in. But in the next second, everything changed. A metallic snap echoed through the ballroom. The boy's body moved before his mind could catch up. His tray crashed to the floor as he bolted forward, his small legs carrying him faster than they ever had before. The guests around him barely registered the blur of movement. They were too focused on their own conversations, their own lives. The chandelier groaned as it began its final descent. She still wasn't looking. His breath caught as he lunged toward her. The distance between them closed in an instant, but the chandelier was faster. The air filled with gasps and screams as the room finally caught up to what was happening. But he was already there. With every ounce of strength in his small frame, he threw himself into her, his body slamming against hers. The force sent her staggering backward, her glass slipping from her hand, shattering before it even touched the ground. The moment stretched impossibly thin, suspended between impact and fate. And then the chandelier hit. A thunderous crash shook the ballroom as crystal and metal exploded against the marble floor. Shards of glass shot outward like deadly stars, scattering in all directions. The impact sent a gust of wind through the room, knocking over champagne flutes and silencing every voice. For a long moment, there was nothing but stillness. Then, the billionaire's wife opened her eyes. She was on the floor, her breath ragged, her pulse racing. Her hands trembled as she braced herself, her body untouched. Her heart hammered in her chest as her mind caught up to what had just happened. She should have been under that chandelier. She should have been... Her wide, disoriented gaze landed on him, the boy. He lay just inches away, his small body sprawled across the floor. Tiny cuts marred his arms, fresh lines of crimson dotting his skin where the flying shards had grazed him. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breath coming in short, shaky gasps. But he had saved her. The reality of it all settled like a weight on her chest. A child, someone she had barely noticed, someone she would have dismissed without a second thought, had just risked his life for her. The room buzzed with stunned murmurs. People who had spent the entire night looking past him now stared, their eyes filled with something new, something like admiration, something like guilt. No one had expected this. No one had expected him. In moments of danger, do we ever really know who will step up to save the day? What do you think? You're watching this unfold now, but would you have acted like this young hero? Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. The applause had not yet died down when the doors to the ballroom swung open. The billionaire himself stepped inside, his tall frame cutting through the crowd like a silent force. He had been away from the event for a short time, called into an urgent meeting, but the moment he returned, he knew something had happened. The energy in the room was different. There was no laughter, no idle chatter, only the sound of people whispering about what had just taken place. His eyes quickly swept over the scene before him. The shattered chandelier, the stunned guests, his wife still visibly shaken, and at the center of it all, a boy, a child, not a guest, not someone from his world, but one of the waitstaff. He frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice firm, authoritative. His wife turned to him, and for the first time in their marriage, she looked at him not as a woman of status, but as someone who had just come face to face with her own mortality. She took a breath, steadying herself, then spoke. "He saved me." The billionaire's gaze shifted to the boy, and the room seemed to hold its breath. For a long moment, he simply studied him, taking in the sight of this young child who stood quietly, his hands still scraped from the glass, his uniform slightly torn from the impact of the fall. The boy looked back, his expression steady but unsure of what was to come next. Finally, the billionaire stepped forward. The crowd parted instinctively, clearing a path between them. The boy had expected many things in his life: indifference, dismissal, even ridicule. But what came next was something he never could have predicted. The billionaire extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice lower now, filled with something more than just formality. "You didn't have to do what you did, but you did it anyway." The boy hesitated before taking his hand, shaking it with a firm grip that surprised even himself. "It was the right thing to do," he said simply. The billionaire nodded, as if those words carried more weight than anything he had heard all evening. Then, with a deep breath, he made a decision, one that, like the boy's choice to act, would change everything. "I want to do something for you," he said. "Something real." The murmurs in the room grew louder, people exchanging glances, wondering what he meant. "You have courage," the billionaire continued, his voice strong but sincere, "and courage should never go unnoticed. I want to offer you something, a scholarship to one of the best schools in the city. Full tuition, everything covered. You'll get the education, the opportunities, the future you deserve." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The boy's heart stopped for a beat. A school like that, a future like that. It had never even been a possibility, not in his world. He had spent his life working, scraping by, knowing that dreams like these belonged to other kids, kids who didn't have to worry about money, about survival. His throat tightened. "Why?" he asked, not out of suspicion, but because he truly did not understand why someone like him was suddenly being given something so life-changing. The billionaire's expression softened. "Because you stepped up when no one else did. You reminded us all that real strength doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from here." He tapped his chest right over his heart. "And that kind of strength deserves to be rewarded." The boy felt the weight of those words settle into his bones. He had spent his entire life watching people ignore him, dismiss him, pretend he did not exist. But now they saw him. They truly saw him. The guests who had once treated him like part of the background now watched him with admiration, whispering about his bravery, about how he had done what none of them could. He was no longer just a boy serving drinks. He was something else entirely. A hero. He glanced at the billionaire's wife. Her gaze was different now, not condescending, not indifferent, but grateful. For the first time, she did not see a boy in a uniform. She saw a person. The boy inhaled deeply, the weight of the moment settling into his chest. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll take it," he said. A slow smile spread across the billionaire's face, and the room erupted in applause once more. As the boy stood there, surrounded by people who finally recognized his worth, he realized something powerful, something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Courage did not come from power. It did not come from money or privilege or the ability to command a room. It came from the heart. And anyone, no matter where they came from, no matter what life had given or taken from them, had the power to change the world with a single act of bravery. Tonight had proved that. And now, his future was brighter than he had ever imagined. The night that had begun as a dazzling display of wealth and status had transformed into something entirely unexpected. What was meant to be an evening of extravagant celebration had become a moment of reckoning, one that no guest in the ballroom would soon forget. The shattered chandelier still lay in fragments on the marble floor, a stark reminder of how close disaster had come. The boy, who had spent the night as nothing more than a nameless server, now stood at the center of it all, not because of wealth, not because of status, but because of the courage he had shown when it mattered most. The billionaire's wife, who had once moved through life without a second thought for those beneath her, had been forced to confront something she had never considered before. The weight of the night's events pressed heavily on her, her mind still replaying the moment she had locked eyes with the boy after he had saved her life. She had spent her life surrounded by luxury, believing that power and influence defined a person's worth. But now, all of that felt hollow in comparison to the raw, selfless bravery of a child who had nothing to his name but his heart. As the applause for the boy finally faded, the conversations in the room took on a new tone. The guests, many of whom had spent their lives believing themselves untouchable, found themselves shaken. They murmured among themselves, reflecting on what they had just witnessed. Some looked ashamed, realizing how easily they had dismissed people like him. Others looked inspired, moved by the idea that true character had nothing to do with the label society placed on people. The billionaire himself watched the boy with quiet admiration. Offering the scholarship had been an impulse, but now, standing there, he knew it had been the right decision. He had built his empire on strategic choices, on investments and careful calculations. But tonight had shown him that the greatest investment he could make was not in business, but in people. As the night wore on, the boy remained humble. He was not used to being the center of attention, and while the praise felt overwhelming, he did not let it change who he was. He had saved the billionaire's wife not for recognition, not for reward, but because it was the right thing to do. And that, he realized, was the greatest lesson of all. At some point, as the night came to a close, the billionaire's wife approached him once more. This time, there was no distance in her gaze, no air of superiority. She looked at him with something she had never offered before: respect. "I misjudged you," she admitted, her voice softer than it had been all night. "I've misjudged a lot of things." The boy tilted his head slightly, watching her with the same quiet patience he had carried all evening. She inhaled deeply before continuing. "Thank you, not just for saving my life, but for showing me something I should have seen a long time ago." The boy simply nodded. He did not need a grand apology. In truth, her words mattered less than the fact that she had changed, that she had finally seen him. As the guests slowly began to leave, the billionaire's wife walked away from the ballroom a different person. She would never look at the world the same way again. Neither would the others who had been there that night. The ripple effect of what had happened would extend far beyond these walls. For the boy, though, the biggest change was yet to come. When he left the grand building that night, stepping out into the cool air, he did not leave the same way he had come. He had walked in as a server, a child who had accepted his place in the world without question. But he walked out knowing he had the power to change it. The scholarship meant a new future, a path that had never seemed possible before. But more than that, tonight had taught him that courage, true courage, was what made all the difference in the world. He had not just saved a life, he had changed lives. As he looked up at the sky, the city lights flickering above him, he let himself imagine for the first time what the future might hold. And for the first time, he believed it could be something great. Because sometimes the greatest heroes come from the most unexpected places. One act of bravery can change not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you.